International Media Assistance here at the National Endowment for Democracy. I'm really impressed that you all made it despite the weather and the change in time. Thank you for being brave souls and coming out this morning. This is a topic that's really close to my heart, and it took me back to my first trip to Belgrade in 1991 when I was a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. It was in June 1991, and as soon as I got into the country and went up to my hotel room, my fixer and translator knocked on the door and came into my room, and she said, "I want to show you what's going on." And we turned on the television, and we looked at the programs that were being broadcast, both in Serbia and in Croatia at that time. This was just after the 10-day war that sealed the independence of Slovenia. And as we looked through those television stations, we started seeing these black and white images and films of people walking across the countryside with pitchforks and axes and guns and different kinds, shotguns and different kinds of weapons. And it was immediately clear to me that these were fabricated or images from 40 years ago. And they continued to play this nonstop programs, all news, all the time, on all the stations. And it was really interesting to me that when we went out and started doing the reporting and trying to find out what was going on, it was clear that these images were being accepted as real. And people believed that those things that had been collected from all over the place and all over the time were being accepted as legitimate. The war in former Yugoslavia was just the first of a series of conflicts over the next 2 decades that were to put on cruel display the extent to which the warlords and warmongers see the media as an indispensable tool for perpetrating their violent goals. Much of the post-conflict analysis of those wars from former Yugoslavia, from Chechnya to Rwanda and Eastern Congo, has noted that the media has been a core part of that strategy, of that war strategy, often as significant as the military and perpetrating the ends, and often as powerful in many ways, and certainly in terms of impact. Today, more than 1 billion people live in countries that can be described as fragile, where poverty and conflict conspire to create a tragic mix for the people who live there. These countries typically have highly partisan media that too often help perpetrate these conflicts and divisions and myths and prevent people from resolving their differences or agreeing on a path forward. But those of us who have witnessed some of these countries up close know that the media is also an absolutely essential part of the solution to those problems and to dealing with the issues that those countries face. Our goal here today is to talk about some of those solutions and how we in the international media development community can contribute to creating a better environment for economic and democratic change in those countries. And it's these countries that have proven the most difficult for the international development community at large. I'm really delighted that we have this distinguished panel with us today and this very, very impressive report that BBC Media Action has put together under the authorship of James Dean, who is one of the key voices in this debate. We're also very happy to have this group of people here in the room, because I know that some of you and many of you and a lot of our colleagues here at NED have firsthand experience in dealing with these countries and working there. So I'm expecting that we'll have a very good discussion here today. And this is this critical issue for us here at CIMA and at NED. The panel is going to be moderated by Eric Robinson, who is a senior program officer here at our Africa program at the National Endowment for Democracy. And for those of you who are following online on Twitter, please use the hashtag CIMA events. It's also listed in your program. So Eric, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for staying in step with Mother Nature and taking the time to join us today, to you in the room and those of us listening to us online and hopefully on Twitter. Today we're going to have 3 presentations, about 10 minutes in length for each one, and then at the end we'll have about 40 minutes of question and answers. And as Mark said, we'd really love to see a very lively discussion take place, particularly from those of you who have experience in the countries at hand or from other parts around the world. I'd like to start off with introducing the James Dean. He has spent more than 30 years working in the field of media development. He's the Director of Policy and Learning at BBC Media Action, where he oversees the organization's research, technical assistance, and policy activities. James is a founding member and later Executive Director of the Panos Institute London, and immediately before joining the BBC World Service Trust, now BBC Media Action, he was Managing Director of the Communication for Social Change Consortium, a New York-based organization set up by the Rockefeller Foundation. James is the commissioning editor of several recent BBC Media Action policy briefings on media in fragile states, including today's briefing paper. He has a master's degree in international communication and development and has written numerous papers and publications on media, information, and communication technologies. Amara Al-Shabander joined IWPR in 2004 and currently holds overall responsibility for activities in Iraq, where IWPR has offices in Baghdad and Erbil. He provides leadership for programs including a media-related legislative reform, security sector reform, women issues and leadership, and human rights programming. Amar holds a degree in sociology and international relations from the University of Westminster in London and speaks fluent Arabic, Persian, English, and Swedish. Michael Dwyer is a senior program officer with USIP's Media Conflict and Peacebuilding Center of Innovation, focusing on traditional media, social media, and data projects in Afghanistan and Pakistan. From 2008 to 2012, he designed and/or managed media development programs for Internews in Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and Malaysia, first as a regional manager in Bangkok, and then as vice president here in Washington, D.C. He lived in Afghanistan from 2004 to 2008, working as country manager of the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, IRIN Humanitarian Radio and News Service, and as program manager of a national university journalism and radio training project. Prior to 2004, Dwyer worked in radio and online media for 10 years. He was a freelance correspondent in Southeast Asia, a radio online producer, and a presenter at the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, and he worked at university radio stations in Sydney and Adelaide. Michael holds a bachelor's degree in philosophy from the University of Adelaide. So without further ado, I'd like to start off with James Dean.
Eric, thank you so much, and thank you to Mark and the National Endowment for Democracy Centre for International Media Assistance for inviting us and hosting this debate. Let me just start by talking a little bit about why we published this briefing and what we hoped to achieve by it. It's entitled Fragile States, the Role of Media in Communication, which is a fairly arrogant title for anything that's just a 25-page document. We don't pretend for a minute that it encompasses all the issues related to media and communication in fragile states. What it is a crystallization, a synthesis of some of the learnings as an organization we've had over the last 3 or 4 years, particularly from a whole series of policy briefings we've published on Iraq, on Somalia, on Kenya, on Afghanistan, and on Pakistan. As well as a great deal of research we've been doing in those countries. We have about 90 researchers within BBC Media Action, very much focused on what's actually happening in these countries, what's happening to the media, but actually very much what's happening to people and how they're getting their information, how they're using communication, what they're trusting, what they're not trusting in terms of media. And the key reason we really wanted to publish this briefing is that we see a set of problems out there that are not really being addressed. And one of those problems was best exemplified for me was actually in another, Seema was kind enough to host another meeting on Afghanistan about 18 months ago, when we published another policy briefing on the media of Afghanistan. And my colleague, the co-author of that, Shirazuddin Siddiqui, talked at that. And one of the key things that he said then was everyone agrees that the media in Afghanistan is a success story, that there's been a huge amount of investment in the media of Afghanistan. But as we enter a transition, or as we are into a transition process of Afghanistan, it's not at all clear where the strategic locus of debate on planning and supporting the future of Afghanistan, of media of Afghanistan, is actually going to take place. And there doesn't seem to be much of a strategy really looking at how the people of Afghanistan are going to be able to chart their own destiny. Where are they going to get their information from? What are their platforms for public debate? Where is the future of Afghanistan going to be shaped in relation to the ordinary people of that extraordinarily divided country? And the media and the communication platforms through that kind of debate, it just wasn't clear that that was being thought about in the context of a transition. And that has really got us thinking about why is that? Why, despite all the money being spent on this issue, despite the real need for a continued intensive focus on support to media, even in a country as high profile as Afghanistan, what's that happening elsewhere in terms of fragile states? And so one of the things that we felt that we really need to look at is, okay, where is policy being shaped on these issues? Now, clearly a lot of it's being shaped from a diplomatic community, but it's also being shaped from a development community. And it's actually the development community that is spending a huge amount of money on support to fragile states in general. A third of all development funding is now focused on fragile states around the world. The European Union spends half its entire budget on support to its entire development budget on support to fragile states. A big priority for the US, is a big priority for the United Kingdom. And if you look at Afghanistan, you see that reflected more broadly, I think, in a lot of the other debates going on within countries in terms of support to fragile states. And a couple of years ago, there was the international development community reached a new deal on support to fragile states. Actually, a very good new deal, not least because it was largely framed by governments and organizations from fragile states. But these issues of media and communication and public debate were largely absent from that new deal. And so the purpose of the briefing was actually not to come up with some huge, complex, sophisticated analysis about all the reasons media and communication is important in fragile states, but to try and take an argument to those who are principally interested in tackling issues of fragility and issues of instability and of conflict, and try and start afresh some of the arguments around why media and communication might be particularly important now in 2014, and perhaps why there's some different issues, why they should be paying a bit more attention to the issue than they have in recent years. So, what is a fragile state, first of all? And that's kind of quite an interesting question to ask. The OECD, there's lots of different definitions of fragile states. Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development defines them as thus: a fragile region or state has weak capacity to carry out basic governance functions. It lacks the ability to develop mutually constructive relations with society. Fragile states are also more vulnerable to internal or external shocks such as economic crisis or natural disasters. And that's a very good definition, and it is a definition that heavily shapes the way in which fragile states are conventionally supported from within the diplomatic, but especially the development community. The first priority is to focus on the capability, the legitimacy, the responsiveness of a state. It starts very much with a focus on the state, and that, we think, makes a great deal of sense. But we think it's missing something pretty fundamental. And our argument, and this is what we say in the policy briefing, is that fragile states are very often also fractured states, where the existence of different politics, religions, or ethnicities makes relationships between communities difficult, and where the building of shared identity can be especially challenging. And that's a focus which accepts the fundamental importance of a state in terms of any prospects of future stability and development and any kind of likelihood of future political settlements, but also suggests that we're not paying attention enough to society. And this was actually significantly accepted, I think, although not reflected in policy, by a lot of the analysis around fragile states. Professor Paul Collier, one of the leading authorities on development, and in his book Wars, Guns and Votes, there's a quote from him, and it says this: "The fundamental mistake of our approach to state building has been to forget that well-functioning states are built not just on shared interests, the kind of shared interests that can develop from elite bargains and settlements at the political level, but on shared identity, something that fundamentally depends on people to be getting along with each other. And coming back to the issue of Afghanistan, and we see elsewhere the capacity for countries to have the kind of public dialogue and debate necessary for the emergence of shared identity, or perhaps more accurately, tolerant identities to emerge at the societal level. We don't see very much of that reflected in a lot of policy making or priorities when it comes to support to fragile states. So that's why we did the briefing, is to try and reiterate and perhaps recrystallize and take forward, hopefully, and spark a debate about how we can start thinking differently and perhaps more urgently about a set of issues that we think are somewhat missing from a lot of the mainstream of a policy discourse around fragile states. Now, what we don't think is that fragile states are somehow, there is something in common with fragile states that makes their media, that made their media landscapes in any way some kind of easy continuum. The idea of Somalia and Afghanistan and Kenya and Pakistan and Korea and North Korea and Nigeria and all having some kind of uniform set of trends going on in them. You think of Pakistan and its extraordinary vibrancy and extraordinary level of media creativity and dynamism and just energy and from that. And you compare it to, difficult to compare that to a Somalia, extraordinarily difficult to compare it to an Eritrea or an Ethiopia. There's nothing ultimately in common across all these countries. And so our focus on fragility really focused on the nature of society. But we did think that for a lot of these states, there were some trends that might be worth quite cautiously pointing to, which we think did suggest a sort of more consistent, something approaching a more consistent analysis might be worth bringing to it. Now, some of these are blindingly obvious and have been much commented, and I'm sure, and many of the excellent reports National CIMA has produced are focused on this in detail. But clearly, a massive explosion in access to information, and we've seen this a lot around the Arab Spring countries, obviously. And fragile states, actually, if you look at them across the board, have some of the fastest growth of mobile telephony, growing sixfold in 5 years. That's so far so obvious. Also obvious is the increasing, because of that, appropriation of media, including by social media, by people with the ability to organize, form new networks, and forge new identities, or at least reformulate old identities. That's also, we saw that a lot in the Arab Spring countries, but it's also much broader than the Arab Spring countries as well. But alongside that explosion in access to information and the role of social media, in terms of traditional media, we're seeing a fragmentation of media environments. We're seeing an explosion in the sheer number of media organizations out there, social, digital, and traditional. In Afghanistan, the number of media increased by 20% per year between 2006 and 2010. Now 75 terrestrial TV and 175 FM radio stations. So there's a lot more media, a lot more access to information, but there's also, as well as being fragmented media, there's also a fracturing of media environments, media catering for specific communities, ethnic communities, religious communities. Some of that's because of economic reasons, opening up new markets in those regions. Sometimes it's political, really, focusing on creating media to serve particular identities in society. And as long as, together with that fracturing of media, we're also seeing, we think at any rate, a lot more co-option of media. The incentives for political actors and factional actors to control, to intimidate, to invest in and create their own media are growing. And that co-option of media by religious, ethnic and other factional interests is also a trend that we're seeing not universally, but increasingly across the board. And of course, within that, the other much commented thing about increasingly young, educated citizenries, the countries we deal with here, Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Kenya, they all feature in the top 20 countries with the highest fertility rates in the world. So in sum, and I'll finish in just a minute, we're seeing an increasingly fractured, increasingly fragmented media in increasingly fractured and fragmented states. And that seems to us to present some challenges to the mainstream of a lot of fragile states thinking at the moment, which is focused principally on the state without paying enough attention, we think, to what's happening in society, and particularly in terms of the role of media in society. Now, I think there's some extraordinarily exciting things happening as a result of all this. I think there's some real, explosion of democratic opportunity, explosion of voice, explosion of economic and political opportunity by people who never had them before. There's also some worrying things happening. We are seeing more warlord media. I think we are seeing more hate media. We are seeing the co-option of media in pursuit of particular interests in society. And at the same time, as the potential cost of neglect of a focus of media is increasing, the actual strategic focus on an understanding of what is happening to the media and working out strategies to support the media actually seems to be decreasing. There's a real at odds here. We don't see much in the way of a clear, concerted, focused effort to really work out how does the media, what is the role of media in communication in a lot of fragile states? How can we best understand it and how can we best support it? And at the moment we're quite worried about the lack of focus on this at the country level and the focus of this at the international level. There's much more to say about some of these things, but the final thing I wanted to say is how, in terms of how these are being panned out, which we can get to the discussion in different countries. But I did want to sort of finally focus on one thing, which is perhaps a rather BBC thing to say, but which is the issue of market failure. We're seeing a lot of drive and energy going to of a much more vibrant media in many countries. We're very excited about parts of that, but we're also worried about some of the co-option of that media. But markets, economics, politics are driving a lot of the development of the media at a local level. We don't quite see where the kind of media that is capable of enabling dialogue across fracture points in society, across the political divides, across the religious divides, across the ethnic divides. Where is the media coming from that is actually going to enable the kind of public conversation that enables people who disagree with each other to have those disagreements peacefully and in public and argue out their issues and forge their destinies through their own public debate rather than through highly fragmented, localized micro debates, which I think a lot of the current media systems are currently encouraging.
Great. Thank you, James, for framing that perfectly for us. Amar?
Thank you, first of all, for putting together this event. I think that James is being very modest about the value and importance of this policy briefing. I'd like to congratulate you and congratulate BBC Media Action. In fact, it has been a very long time since I've seen a report of this value on media development. I've been in this business for 10 years. It's not a long time, but still I think it's a significant experience. I think the importance of the report for me is in 3 points. Point number one, it establishes in a firm manner that media development has a value per se, regardless of the processes it intends to support. For example, international donors, including US, most of the time support media projects that provide support for other operations, let's say elections, human rights monitoring, women empowerment, and so forth. But the report establishes firmly that media development per se has a value, and media development should be approached in a strategic manner, not as a tactical intervention to support another process. Point number two, the linkage that the report has established between media and the creation of identity, whether national or subnational identity, is a very important point as well. In my mind, in my experience, no attention at all has been paid in international media development to this factor. Now, the report discusses a number of examples, including Iraq and Afghanistan. It shows that the explosion of the media, the diversity of the media, supports subnational identities and enforces those subnational identities. There is a value in that, but it has to be taken further. These subnational identities have been the cause for a lot of the trouble that these countries are facing. By suppressing them, none of the problems will be solved. However, these countries and these societies need a lead time to establish their subnational identities, feel safe in those identities, and then develop further to develop a joint national identity. And this is, at the moment, it's not happening. And I think a lot of international support needs to be diverted to support media institutions in these countries to become the promoters of the national identity and the national dialogue that produces this identity. National identity is, of course, a central pillar in any nation-building process, and I know nation-building has become a bit of a curse word these days. However, it's a reality and it's a necessity. Media development contributes to nation-building, whether we like it or not, or whether we reject the term or not. The other point that also the report picks up is the analysis of the diversity and the funding of the media. Now, in countries like Iraq and Afghanistan, we know that media in general is partisan media. It is supported by political money, it's supported by maybe regional countries, supported by international donors, and by other unknown actors. The one thing that we've also noticed with this partisan media is, despite the fact that the majority, we can't say all of them, but the majority, although they push for a certain factional agenda, but their discourse at large is nationalistic, and it's a nationalist discourse. The report mentions that the Iraqi media during the years of civil war, 2005, 2006, 2007, despite promoting certain agenda, they stopped short of promoting violence. And that's true. That's a correct conclusion. Today, if we look at Iraqi media, it is still factional, but their discourse is still national. I mean, none of these media outlets single out, even if they promote factional agenda, they always dress them in a national picture or an image. So I guess, despite the gloomy picture, there is a lot of opportunities. There are a lot of opportunities that we, as media development community, can bank on if the donors support us, and we can definitely take media development in this country a step further in the right direction, supporting the nation-building projects that are ongoing at the moment. And I think I mean, speaking of the Middle East and the Arab Spring countries, so-called Arab Spring countries at the moment, we are at a very critical stage in the nation-building process. And if we do not plan and implement projects that help the media contribute to the national debate, the nation-building, and the identity-building process, then we will have to spend more money, more efforts, and more resources to fix whatever errors are happening now, 10 years down the line. Thank you.
Michael?
Well, thank you, and it's great to be here. And I remember when the BBC report on Afghanistan first came out, and it was sort of in early 2012, I think, at this point. You know, I was really struck by the fact that I think in our sector there's an awful lot of research that's done, assessments that are done pretty much in the self-interest of the organisations that are doing them. And I think the balance and the comprehensiveness, the ground truth nature of the report was really impressive, and we should certainly have more of that. I think for anyone who's worked in Afghanistan, the media sector over the last 13 or so years, you can't help, in some sense, being inspired, awed. There are some awesome journalists and some people who've done some great programs, and people have had opportunities to hear things, take part in discussions that simply weren't possible before. And I think the reports, the more recent report, along with that 2012 report, foreshadow also, though, a lot of the challenges that the Afghan media faces as we go into this sort of transition period. stations will close. And I think and that's a certainty. The question more is at this point, which stations will close? Is it the ones that are doing truly independent journalism? Hopefully, it's not those, but it may be the stations that have other sources of income, illicit or illicit, from regional powers and other places that are the ones that tend to survive. I think media freedoms will certainly suffer, and that seems. I mean, there is always Afghanistan hasn't had sort of necessarily sort of a centralised form of really sort of harsh intimidation of journalists. There's always been a very sort of diffuse form of this kind of intimidation, but I think we'll probably see more intimidation of journalists in the future. The media law will not be implemented. Key parts of it haven't been. The mechanisms for actually adjudicating debates between journalists and the state and other actors simply haven't been implemented. And at this point, it's sort of hard to see where the impetus for that would come from. RTA is probably not going to be transformed into a public broadcaster. So there are many challenges. In sort of preparing to speak today, I did sort of go back over some of the fragile states literature, and wow, there's a very wide range of countries, a wide range of sort of definitions about what is a fragile state. A wide range of prescriptions about what ought to be done in those states, and an awful lot of think tank reports about the whole thing. And it was easy to come away sort of feeling more confused rather than more enlightened. And one of the sort of questions I think might be interesting for us to talk about is sort of where we think this fragile states debate is going. It's sort of 10 to 15 years into it. How resilient is that particular model within the development sector? Where is it fragmenting? Where is it going? I mean, to use a cliche, we probably want to be skating to where the puck is, and not where it is at present or where it was. And there certainly seems to be a progression from a focus on sort of technocratic state building to a greater focus on citizen-state relationships and the social contract between citizens and the state. Where it might be heading, hopefully, is a greater focus on social cohesion, the kinds of things that we've already talked about in this panel about, the citizen-to-citizen relations, which are sort of at the foundation of having a nation, having a state in the first place, and that's something which I sort of hope to get to in the remaining sort of 6 or 7 minutes that I have. What can we learn from Afghanistan? Well, hopefully a lot. While the media has been a considerable success in Afghanistan, to say that in some senses is easy because the bar for success is pretty low. The Afghanistan project as a whole is obviously struggling in some pretty obvious ways, and there are some familiar things that people point to when they talk about the troubles in Afghanistan. That our approach was far too based on liberal democratic versions of the state. And imposing something like that, it happened far too quickly. Sorry, I just totally lost my train of thought. And I think the media side of that, was the same. I mean, the media side of what happened in Afghanistan was, in many ways, very driven by external visions of what a media should look like. It was driven very much by what we thought we could achieve. The kinds of easy things that you can do. You can train journalists. You can set up radio stations. You can try to affect the legislative agenda. So there was a technocratic process and one that happened very quickly. I think. There was an awful lot of state building. Firstly at a very centralised level, that didn't seem to go so well. Then people went down to sort of a subnational level and tried to do state building, and that hasn't gone so well either. If anyone sort of remembers, the government in a box line and things like that. And so we had this sort of initial period of media development in Afghanistan. Probably a growing nuance in the debate about fragile states in the second half of the Afghanistan project, but unfortunately there was this sort of massive influx of money that came with the surge that in many ways I think probably meant that those nuances didn't really appear in Afghanistan, because again people were doing things so quickly. There was so much money coming into all kinds of different media organisations, and so at the same time that you had media organisations trying to encourage some local media organisations to be, frugal, to have business plans, to do financial planning, you had other parts of the whole aid apparatus, military contractors dumping money into these same organisations, and so there just wasn't a lot of us were working, I think, at cross purposes. To some extent, I mean, we could talk about that for a lot longer, but. One of the things I sort of take away from it is whether the language of building things is really an appropriate language for the way that we do development work. It's almost like we feel that if we have the right blueprint, that we'll be, and if we have the right amount of money, and if we try hard enough, that somehow we'll be able to succeed. And it seems to me that what's happening with the fragile states debate at the policy levels is that we're changing the recipes, but we're not actually sort of fundamentally changing that idea that what we're doing in these countries is that we're going in and that we're building something. I think, and we probably do need to focus on a slightly more radical rethink of what it is that we're trying to do. Because I think when we start with the idealised vision of what we have in a country, in my case, such as Australia, and we try to transplant that to somewhere else, I mean, that's just not the process that happened in our own countries. And so I wonder why we imagine it's going to happen in Afghanistan. I mean, to take an example from Australia, Australia has one of the most vibrant community media sectors in the world, but it didn't start because people thought that there ought to be more conversations between citizens and the state. It happened because universities wanted to do distance education, and because a certain number of quite wealthy people wanted to listen to classical music on FM radio. And it's become something else, and other people have latched onto that, and a social justice agenda has followed from that. But that's not necessarily why it started. But we take these endpoints, and then we sort of go into a country like Afghanistan and almost treat them as starting points, or treat them as something that could be achieved in a 5 or 10 year sort of framework. So, I mean, I don't think we need to go back to sequentialism, but I think we can ask ourselves some sort of hard questions about how we do media development in fragile states. Because I think people talk about Afghanistan being a success in terms of the media, but then how are we actually judging that? Are we judging that simply because there are an awful lot of media outlets, radio stations, and television stations broadcasting? That's probably not a wonderful metric to be using. Are we doing it because there isn't a lot of enthusiasm for the media in Afghanistan amongst journalists and amongst the community? I mean, that would be a better one, but that still doesn't get to a question of quality. Are we judging what's happening in Afghanistan because media organisations are actually doing quality work, or are we taking it a step further, possibly, and saying, well, they're not just doing quality work, but it's quality work which is oriented around sort of specific issues which are really important for the development of the country, for security, for peace, or for something else. So, and I think there are people who've sort of coming up with different ways of thinking about what we could be doing in fragile states. So someone like maybe Thomas Carruthers, who certainly is not a sequentialist, but would certainly say that we need to be doing things a whole lot slower than we are at present. There are others that are trying to sort of bring complexity theory into this debate and to say that, well, in the kinds of in fragile states, there are so many different things going on at the same time. There are so many different things that you're trying to fix that some of these things, there are technical solutions to some of these things, but some of these problems are adaptive. They're not going to be solved in that kind of way. There are others that say that we could take a different geographic focus, and so in some fragile states, people are now saying, well, let's not focus on the nation as we tend to. Let's focus on the city, where the relationships, say, between society and citizens are far closer in some ways, and maybe we'll achieve more at that more sort of micro scale rather than by starting off by thinking about the national scale. And there are others that sort of promote far more sort of ethnographic approach to things and sort of suggest, so people like Nicole Stremlau and the work she's done in Somaliland, that are sort of a hybrid approach that in some sense accepts what's there, sees the value in what's there, even if it's not formal traditional media, even if it's communications at a tea shop, And thinking about this not in terms of how we develop the media, but James, as you mentioned at the beginning, well, how do people actually communicate with each other more effectively? And so we don't go into this with some kind of normative view of media development and saying, well, this is how it should be. We go into this thinking about, well, how can people communicate more effectively to achieve what they want to achieve? And to the extent that formal traditional media is part of that, great. To the extent that social and citizen media is part of that, great. But there are going to be other things about it as well. So, again, sort of thinking, sort of going beyond the immediate, yes, Afghanistan was a success story line, I think there are things that we could ask ourselves about the exercise and then that could orient what we do in the future. So, for example, in Afghanistan, if centre-periphery relations are the issue that is one of the issues that is sort of holding back social cohesion, then to what extent has what we've done over the last 13 years had a positive effect on centre-periphery relations? Well, in fact, the vast majority of the media production and distribution comes out of Kabul, and it's one way. It's from Kabul to the provinces or to radio stations around the place. There isn't very much from the periphery coming back to the centre. So should we be doing media development in a different way? Because I think this kind of highly centralised version of the media, which often mimics a highly centralised version of states, is often something that we see in this fragile state context. Or is it urban-rural relations, which are the sort of the issue that we hope media addresses in Afghanistan? Because if that's what we're hoping for, then we also have a problem, because the vast amount of media development in Afghanistan has happened in urban areas. All of the FM radio stations are in urban areas, and the physics of low, medium power FM means that the signals only travel about 40 kilometres. The mobile phone networks are in the urban areas. The television networks are in the urban areas. In fact, for people living in rural Afghanistan, they have pretty much what they had 13 years ago, which is the RTA, BBC, Voice of America, Radio Azadi, and those international broadcasters. Or, if state-citizen relationships, if citizen-state relationships are the issue, then what kinds of media organisations are actually capable of dealing with those issues in a context in which the state is so weak? How useful is it to have journalists critiquing minions in the state who really don't have the power to change things? And then finally, if it's about social cohesion, about communities working together, well then what kinds of journalism skills or what kind of media skills or other skills should we be teaching people? What skills should they be using? And so the final point I'll make is if I go back to 2002 in Afghanistan, there was a report by AMAC, the World Association of Community Radio Broadcasters, that said, well, look, we should be careful not just to train people in doing news journalism. We should think about communities. We should think about the role that the ordinary people in communities could play as communicators, and if it's citizen-to-citizen relationships, if it's community building and cohesion that we're interested in, then maybe the things that we shouldn't necessarily be teaching and encouraging, maybe it shouldn't be news journalism. Maybe station managers need to be trained in mediation. And this sort of, to some extent we go this way with conflict-sensitive journalism, but it's uncomfortable for many of us because it blurs the boundaries between journalists and activists, and that's something that some people find troubling, including many journalists. So, I think there are problems in Afghanistan. I think we have taken this normative approach. I think that's contributed to a lot of the problems. And coming from, say, the United States Institute of Peace, where we sort of think more about social cohesion, it's some of these other things that I think that we probably should be focusing more on in the future.
Great. Thank you, Michael. I'll keep my comments brief so we can get to the question and answers, but I'll talk briefly on Somalia and Kenya. The endowment has had a 15-year, strong 15-year relationship with the media sector in Somalia. And when you talk about the role of development and perhaps there hasn't been enough attention paid to the media sector, Somalia is one situation where a significant amount of money and energy has been put into the media sector through funding radio stations, journalist training, and going to the fragile state component and the role that the media played, early on, yes, when you're talking about the late 1990s, the media sector, radio stations, played a very deleterious role in enhancing, the Klan fault lines. The media was also captured by the warlords that you talked about. The interesting thing is that I think it's somewhat of a success story in the Somali context, because after a decade of funding and training and support, and also because of demands from the population for more balanced reporting, you've seen a significant improvement in the quality of the journalism. But you've also seen a significant improvement in the focus on journalism on the issues and not on clan politics. Warlords, for the most part, have been taken out of the equation. And so we're in a very interesting situation right now where we've had a proliferation of media outlets. You have 30 or more radio stations, and now the complaint in Mogadishu, for example, is we have too many. And how do we take a look at the funding model in Somalia right now in Mogadishu and change it to make it one where radio stations actually have to compete with one another in a business environment so that they can stay relevant, rather than depending on $30,000, $50,000, $70,000 in support from the international community? How can they now start to follow a business model and start to pursue funding? And so from that perspective, I think things have gone along fairly well. In Somaliland, it's a slightly different story. Somaliland is held up as a democratic success story in the region. When you look at the Sudans, you look at Djibouti, you look at maybe the wavering Kenya, but certainly South Central Somalia. Somaliland has done quite well. However, they have no independent radio stations. They have Radio Hargeisa, just the government-run radio station, and people were forced to rely on print media. And of course, in a population that relies on the oral tradition, and not that many people read and write, you get a pretty good firm control of the state, which it seems that many people have been willing to overlook. And in terms of new media forming, both in Somaliland and in South Central and in Puntland, the websites have started to, I would say, repeat history from the early days of radio. In the proliferation of websites, there must be 50, 60 Somali language websites out there. And you saw the same trajectory taking place in that there is this capture from everybody's opinion, every sub-clan opinion, basically attacking one another. And it slowly over the past 5 years, you're starting to see that change as people look at the number of clicks that go onto their websites, as people get bored with this type of vitriol back and forth. And so people are forced to self-select and self-censor and say, hey, maybe I better play a better game here so I can remain competitive with people who are actually producing news. The interesting thing in Somaliland with their lack of independent radio is they always point to Radio Colline in Rwanda as the reason that they do not want to have a strong independent radio in Somalia. And so it's their fear of that open expression that's forcing them to clamp down. The effect of this is actually making the Somaliland state more fragile as people become more and more frustrated with the lack of information flowing in, because they're still getting information. There still is some television. Information flows, and anyone who knows Somali society, it's 2 degrees of separation. Information moves from Sweden to London to Somalia in 5 minutes. So I think that in some places you have to begin to rethink this. There's an interesting paper out just now in this issue of Journal of Democracy on authoritarian states and state media, and that really tackles the issue of authoritarian rule, and also the role of state media in weak democracy. So I'd suggest taking a look at that. Talking about funding, there's a massive pledge for Somalia, as there has been for Afghanistan and Iraq. A lot of money has been spent. So a series of meetings in Turkey, London, and Brussels saw $1 billion or $2 billion being pledged. Now, there's very little conversation about media and the role of media in this massive amount of development money. But the money has yet to go out, so perhaps now is a good time to take the issues that you're framing here, and perhaps those of us who follow Somalia try and get ourselves interjected into this process before the money gets spent out. Moving on to Kenya. I won't. You did a very good job, of covering the context. I won't go into the history of Kenya, but the question I hear talking to people on the ground in relation to media is the degree of self-censorship. Sometimes it's self-censorship for fear of reprisal from the state. There's less of that now in Kenya than there was 20 years ago, perhaps. But as you point out in your briefing, the complaint in the past election was that there was self-censorship to not do reporting for fear of actually engendering, to ask too many tough questions, that the media went too soft in this case. So it was a very interesting dynamic.
People have called it a peace lobotomy.
The peace lobotomy, yeah. And there were significant complaints from civil society on this, particularly when it came time to question the results of the election. Just very briefly on the role of going forward for media and how it may actually move it from, as you talked about, from the center to the periphery. With the new constitution in Kenya and the devolution process to 47 counties, the media sector is talking about how will media look in these counties. A number of people are saying that new media outlets that are separate from the national media at the center of the country are going to form to be able to, so that they can respond to the needs of the people, the interests of the people at the local level. And so some people are predicting that you're going to see brand new media outlets getting out there so that people can get information out in the periphery that's related to them, but also related to this new dispensation, this new political dispensation as outlined in the Constitution. And what kind of competition will take place now at the national level as they will probably begin to establish media outlets in the county structure? Will there begin a competition take place? And also, how will you fund these new media outlets, as they begin to create? What's the funding model? And I think that's a question we're going to have to look at as our conversation continues. I would just like to point out a very brief anecdote. Back in 2009, talking with a potential grantee, they were recounting to me a conversation with a person with the Ministry of Information in Kenya, and they were trying to apply for a radio license in the estate or slum of Kibera. And he said, listen, I've got a really nice radio license on a small island off the coast in the Indian Ocean that you can go ahead and conduct a radio program there. However, I might as well just give you 3 large trucks of weapons if I'm going to give you a radio license in this large population center that we need to keep, that the state needs to keep under control, thereby showing the power that people recognize flat out. I just said to him, there's no way we're going to give you a radio license in this location. So the questions that, as we move from, well, I'll make one more point. It's on the issue of identity. And I think that all of you have brought this up, and I think this is something that really needs to be tackled. Some of you out here have significant experience in South Sudan, let's say. And right now in South Sudan, you're seeing significant fracturing taking place. And one of the target points that we had identified here at the endowment was a need to increase the support to the media sector in South Sudan. And one of the key issues in South Sudan is this crisis in identity, this need to create this identity. And how do you do it, create the national identity, as you're saying, at the same time, being able to form these subsets of identity, while at the same time, it's kind of like walking and chewing gum at the same time. You can't I would posit that you can't do one and then the other. You kind of have to make both happen at the same time. And, what would that look like? So moving into questions, I'll just toss a couple of things out there. The identity issue, the funding issue. How do we make how do we make the funding happen? In describing a fragile or fractured state, you mentioned that the population is often ambivalent toward the state. How would you describe country attitudes toward the media sector, and what role has that played in the flourishing or, I wouldn't say stagnation, but the lack of movement in the development of the media sector? And also, in some cases, we've seen that development and stability for some donors trump other freedoms. I'm thinking of places like Ethiopia and Rwanda, which you mention in your report. Is this a wrong-headed approach?
Shall I?
Start with that, and then we'll move to the audience.
So, on the crucial issue of between freedom and stability, I think my own view is that we've been very poorly served by the debate on this issue, and including on the research and on the academic debate. So if you look at the research, there's very little actual research, I don't think anyway. There is some, but if you actually look at the research connecting media and fragility, there's quite a lot of media and conflict, but it's a slightly different thing. The academic debate on media and fragility is pretty sparse, in my view. And maybe this is a slightly Eurocentric or non-US thing, so I think there's probably a lot more here, which I've also looked at. But there is a set of arguments around academics who focus on the role of media in society. And there is a set of arguments that focus of academics and policymakers on the role of stability. And in my view, they've never really argued with each other. And so, there's a famous report from the London School of Economics, which I quote in a paper in 2005, which is also which argued that actually it argued that too many international media organizations had a highly naive view of political complexity in, as they said, crisis states or fragile states. And that they came in with their preconceived templates of opening up the media regardless of political context, and that they felt this was an extraordinarily dangerous, destabilizing thing to do that could actually ultimately lead to violence and, in the case of Rwanda, genocide. And that a lot of media types were just fundamentally political naives. And that report actually came from the main research centre funded by the from the UK Department for International Development on crisis states. And so it was their main sort of place they looked to for advice on the role of media in fragile states. Their warning was, don't support the media, because by supporting the media, you are effectively, it's a recipe for instability in extremely weak and divided states. Now, the trouble was that I think there's been other research that says the opposite, and there's been, but we helped to put together a conference at the end of last year, a couple of months ago at Wilton Park in the UK, and we deliberately brought together lots of media freedom people, media development people, with a lot of people who are deeply, deeply skeptical and deeply scared, actually, about this idea of external organizations going in and opening up the media. Now, our argument, ultimately, I've got two arguments here. The first is that there are arguments on both sides of this debate, and it kind of depends on the state and depends on the situation and so on. So let's have this discussion in an informed, intelligent, structured way, based on what the evidence is, based on what the politics is. And these are issues too important to get wrong. And so all of us, I think, in my community, in the media development community, the do no harm principle is absolutely vital, and we do need to know what the hell we're doing. So that's the first argument. But the second argument is that somehow that the arguments against support to media are equated to, well, we've got another option here. There's a policy option available to us that we can just keep a lid on all this stuff. Just censor the media, control it, keep it tight. Don't open it up. And to us, that's no longer a particularly credible policy option. Media is changing, communication is changing in all these states. We know that. It's a fatuous thing, almost a fatuous thing to be saying. And yet, that reality, that crude reality about the way in which people are communicating, seizing communicative power in very interesting and sometimes exciting and sometimes worrying ways, seems to me to be slightly bypassing a lot of the arguments around fragile states. These are new political realities. If you're worried about media going wrong in a country, that's kind of quite an important reason to be engaging with it. So whether you're worried about media going wrong, or you're excited about the way in which media offers political, economic, social opportunity in a country, these are all arguments to be paying attention to it. And that's a fundamental argument around this report. It's not necessarily just to say, I've fundamentally come down on the side that I think free and plural media is a major contributor to stability in society, precisely for the reasons you mentioned in the context of Somaliland. If you don't invest in it, you're putting a lid on the pressure cooker, things will explode in the end. But whatever you think, for goodness sake, take it seriously. The issue is really important, and it doesn't seem to be getting the latency and currency and urgency that the issue demands, regardless of whether you come from. And the first part of that is, let's have that argument. Let's keep on having the argument between people who believe state stability, creation of the legitimacy and capacity of a state is important, number one. This media stuff is too worrying to be considered. It's complex, it's political, it's messy, it's difficult, but that's not a reason for not doing it.
Mara, any comment? Yeah. Okay. Brief comment.
Very brief. I think many times state actors think that they are, or the media development community is in control of processes and development in the fragile countries. That is not true. If we do not engage the media, eventually a media sector will develop that will realize all the fears we are talking about without engagement and without intervention.
Okay. Let's take some questions from the audience.
Thanks, Michael Allen with the NED. There were a couple of references during the discussion to the role of regional powers, and indeed the report makes the point that Iran, for example, is reported to be the second largest donor of media assistance in Afghanistan. Given that in the neighborhoods that we're talking about, regional powers tend to be illiberal at best and anti-democratic at worst, what can you say? Can you elaborate a bit more on the role of these regional powers, and specifically the role of Iran in Afghanistan and in Iraq? To what extent does it promote a sectarian political agenda as opposed to an inclusive dialogue?
We also have a question here from online.
I have a question from Twitter from Susan Abbott. The question is, what are some examples of where media development has contributed to national identity?
I have a question, too. I just wonder if nobody really mentioned the extent to which this whole debate about the future and the approach to fragile states needs to engage more aggressively with the rest of the development community, such that the media sector is also really involved in a lot of the core decisions that are being decided about how post-conflict and fragile state aid is being allocated and approached. So I'd be interested to hear how you see that. I mean, you all talked a lot about, you talked about a fundamental, Michael, fundamental rethinking that's based more on what the local communities are trying to do. Now, the aid community has given lip service to that for the last 20 years. And yet we're still going in with prescriptions and blueprints and telling people this is the model you have to follow. How do we engender that debate? How do we create a more active debate with the rest of that group of interested parties, both local governments and the rest of the donor community?
James is going to.
Talking too much here. Let me start with the Iran question and the regional powers, which I'm going to sort of slightly dodge because I'm not going to try. We made a clear claim in the Media of Afghanistan briefing based on an awful lot of conversations that we had, which we found difficult to actually document in volume terms. But yes, Iran was almost certainly the second largest supporter of media to Afghanistan after the US. And that was funding particular interests in society, and that the growth of warlord media was a concerning part of the future media landscape of Afghanistan, and that this was alone a pretty good reason to be having a clearer, more intense focus on actually how to support an independent media in Afghanistan. More broadly, let's just step back a bit. Now, so people like us, I think, certainly myself, throughout the 90s and the early part of this century, I think we saw, very substantially due to the media, a massive opening up of public space, a massive opening up of public debate. We had widespread liberalization and democratization of the media all around the world, and then that was followed by the extraordinary explosion of social media, digital media, new technologies, all extraordinarily exciting in many respects in terms of the creation of an independent public space. In my view, particularly when it comes to fragile states, we are seeing a narrowing of a public space. The political incentives for capturing and co-opting media, social and particularly perhaps traditional, for media to act in the interests of a particular, your own interests, those incentives are growing. It's becoming very important to have your own mouthpiece in society, not just government, but whoever you are in society. And at the same time, the engines of forces that can protect their public space, that can protect independent media that's actually working in a public interest and not in a narrow factional interest, those barriers, those buffers, those safeguards seem to be becoming much more difficult to sustain. And so I think there is generally a significant trend of, after that massive outflowing of public space, we're seeing a narrowing, a co-option of public space by factional interest. And I think that's deeply worrying. And it's got particularly stark and worrying implications in the states in which we're talking about. So I think regional powers have got that incentive, and I think people within countries have got that incentive, and I think those incentives, those powers, those forces, economic and political, are becoming somewhat overwhelming, and we find it deeply worrying. In terms of an example of media and national identity, traditionally, I think this is one of the key conclusions of the report, recommendations of the report. Traditionally, if you want to use media to foster state building, traditionally in the past you do it from the top. You're a Suharto, you're a new area, you control the media, and you basically tell people this is your identity, and then you use the media to determine that and dictate it. Not only do I would argue that's not a particularly progressive way of looking at it, but it's increasingly not an option available to the state building project. To me, I think state building needs to come from the grassroots, and it needs to come through a national debate and a national dialogue, and that's why I think one of the key reasons why you do need the role of the media capable of sustaining a national public conversation is becoming much more important than it was, arguably more important than it's ever been. But the actual capacity to create the platform for that dialogue is becoming really quite limited. Where is the money going to come from? Where is the force coming from? An example of it, I'm going to be now parochial and talk about us just for a moment, but my favourite BBC Media Action project of all, there are a few, is in Afghanistan, where we are working with the state broadcaster RTA on a project called Open Jirga. And that's a project where RTA has agreed that this will be produced in accordance with BBC editorial guidelines of impartiality and balance, and where we simply put national leaders in front of ordinary citizens to be questioned on the issues that they think are important, and to engage in a conversation across the country but is on the issues that they think are of concern. And we bring people from all over Afghanistan into that conversation. We fly or bus people in. It's a very complicated thing to make sure that there is a genuine representation from across the country. And that now reaches 9 million people across Afghanistan. Hamid Karzai agreed to come on, having watched it and said this is an important thing to happen, agreed to come on, volunteered actually to come onto the program 2 or 3 months ago, and got some some pretty rigorous questioning. First time in Afghanistan's history that a head of state has been publicly questioned by the ordinary people of his country. Never happened before. And this happened on national media. And it is exciting because it is a national public conversation shaped and driven by the audience, by people who they ask the questions. They're ones setting the agenda. We don't tell them what to say. We don't say this is a debate on decentralization or politics or transition. It's up to them to decide.
Amar, Michael, do you have any comment, for example, on the issue of how do you create a vibrant cross-discussion, as Mark brought up?
But however, there are a set of programming that can definitely contribute to this type of debate and the creation of national identity. I can give you a couple of examples. In Iraq in particular, Iraq is made up of roughly 19 different ethnicities, sects, etc. Most of these people don't know anything about each other, for example. Programming that could educate local population about their counterparts could contribute to such a debate. Political programming on issues, joint issues. For example, we did a human rights TV mag in 2 languages that was broadcasted for 2.5 years, covering the entire country from north to south, east to west, with no differentiation on sect, ethnicity, age, or any other issues. And it did bring people together. I mean, it helps them forget their subnational identity and starting to think what it means to them being Iraqis, what services they need as Iraqis, and so on. So there are definitely models for the media to help develop the national identity and increase the national debate and the dialogue.
Yeah, I mean, partly, sort of thinking about a project that Internews did when I worked with them. And this is not necessarily national identity. I mean, this sort of goes sort of a regional effort, and that was sort of bringing together young bloggers from Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. And actually, we brought them together in Afghanistan because it's the one place that all of those people can actually be together without having too many problems. And then to go back and then engage with the blogging communities in their countries and talk about issues of common concern. And as you often do in a mediation kind of situation, the idea there was let's not start with the things that divide people, or let's start with the things that people actually have in common. And so maybe it would be parental pressure to do really well, or concerns about what the environment is going to be like, or things like that. So that it's obviously often easier to start with those kinds of things that people have in common, rather than to start with the hard, knotty, dysfunctional things that people are going to fight about and that are causing them so much grief in their lives. And so, it's a kind of a discussion program in Afghanistan that touches on issues, but it's not hardcore current affairs or hardcore news reporting. That's sort of calling people out and saying, well, you're not doing this. I'm thinking about sort of other sort of softer programming, things like radio dramas. And the New Home, New Life in Afghanistan is a great example. USIP has been doing one which is sort of focusing on sort of bringing having young people in Afghanistan thinking about sort of what kind of Afghanistan does the next generation want to have, rather than sort of constantly sort of raking over the coals of the problems that have been caused by the previous generation. You have sort of travel programs. There's one on Tolo TV in Afghanistan, That might be a better way of bringing people together. In Iraq, USIP has done a reality television game show that brings together people. Salam Shabab, that brings people from different parts of the country together to pretty standard reality TV. Do a series of different tasks: one artistic, intellectual, physical, and there's quite a vibrant social media discussion that happens with that. So, yeah, it's again for me it sort of comes back sort of one of the things I sort of mentioned earlier, which is it's easy when we go to a country like Afghanistan to start off by teaching people who, what, when, where, how, and why, and what makes something newsworthy. And everyone wants to be. Well, this was sort of back in sort of when I arrived in 2004. Everyone wanted to be least to set. Everyone wanted to do hard talk. And there's obviously a place for that. But there are a lot of other things we can be doing as well.
Questions? Over here. We'll take 2 or 3.
Thank you. I think this question is specifically for Eric. And my question is, in Somalia, with the proliferation of new media outlets, how does one ensure, or has there been increased activity by al-Shabaab in taking advantage of the fact that there are now more media outlets that may not be as closely checked as when there were fewer?
I think it goes back to my comment that, let me take, is there another one? I didn't see another one. Oh, there is on Twitter. Okay.
I have another question from Twitter, from Ryan Flynn. The question is for James. He wants to know what's media's role in the New Deal for fragile states.
And we have one more back here.
UNESCO. My question may actually be on a piggyback on the one from Twitter, and that was the role of new media and what's happening in terms of development assistance to new media producers in places like Iraq, Afghanistan.
I'll start off with the Somalia question. I made the comment that there are 2 degrees of separation in information in Somali society. And if someone's co-opted, for example, by al-Shabaab, everyone knows about it instantly, and they almost automatically write it off. Everyone in the donor sector knows about it. Somali citizens know about it. So while there was, in those areas controlled by al-Shabaab, they did attempt to and have used new media and old media to try and push forth their ideas. But I think that people know what's happening, and so people take it with a very large grain of salt. So it really hasn't been a significant factor.
So on the New Deal and on the sort of role of media generally in development, so let me clarify one thing. I'm not necessarily talking about, when I say I don't think there's enough focus on this issue, I don't necessarily mean there's not enough money. I don't think there is enough money, and when the money is spent, it often comes in big splurges and then just completely stops. My biggest concern is about strategy and follow through, and where, particularly when it comes to the fragile states architecture, the development architecture in general, with kind of systems that decide and determine development policy, spending, priorities, strategy. Where does media sit? And I would argue it's lost. It's not. It doesn't sit anywhere. There's no one's real responsibility at national level to work out, okay, these issues of media and communication and public debate are really important for the future of this country, and to denote a real status to those issues, and let's put those into the way in which we think about our overarching programs of support to these countries. When media is considered, and this was a conversation we had at Wilton Park, you had at Wilton Park several donors, about 20 donors there, some of them from the human rights departments, and some of them from the conflict and stability departments. And the conflict and stability people said, if you want to talk about media, talk to my human rights people. And yet what we're saying is that this is fundamentally an issue of conflict and stability. And so there's no obvious place, as far as we can see, where these issues make it to the table when you're considering the strategy of support to a country. Now, I have absolutely no criticism at all to the New Deal on fragile states. I think it's an excellent process and it's not the kind of process that would get to the to this kind of issue. It's broader in terms of its principles and so on. But nevertheless, there isn't the place or the space within aid arguments, development arguments, and actually I think also to some extent diplomatic arguments, but can really say these issues are important or not, let's consider them, and then give them their appropriate place when it comes, and space and priority when it comes to support to particular countries. And I think the cost of that in relation, the development cost and the simple cost to the political and economic development of these countries is beginning to become pretty profound.
But how do you inject that into the conversation, particularly at the policymaking level, as Mark was talking about earlier? How do you we often advise civil society to become more professional, to get a clearer understanding of policy processes and budget-making processes. You can't insert yourself at the end of the process. Things are already done. How do you get, particularly those who are the subcontractors, the implementers, and then their local partners, how do you get them to develop an advocacy campaign and strategy to push back up and get that seat at the table? And I feel that people are so focused on implementing, so busy doing the daily work, that they don't step back and say, hey, we have to become advocates for ourselves for this whole process. Anyone else like to talk to that? How would you like to work with people from whom you receive money to get yourself at the table?
Actually, we always, and in almost every meeting with our donors, we keep repeating the following sentence. We are very bad in talking about ourselves and what we do. And it's not only IWPR, it's across the board. I mean, there are other organizations that are better than us, but across the board, media development organizations are very bad in talking about themselves and what they do and how they think the process should go. Simply, the resources are not enough. I mean, there is a lot of money that's being poured into doing the actual work. However, there are not enough resources for media development organizations, media and civil society development organizations, to basically put the message forward to their donors and spend time and effort on making the message very clear on what they need, how they think things should progress. And that's a big problem.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the problems is obviously just how the whole aid industry is structured. So by the time you actually get into a country, you've gone through an RFA process, you've developed a proposal, you've chosen your particular partners who are going to be the people that you work with, and that necessarily involves excluding a lot of other people. And if, as in the case of Afghanistan, if you're the incumbent organisation that's been working on media development for the last 13 years, there are going to be people in the country who have a tough time coordinating with an organisation like Internews, and it's very hard to have those kinds of coordination discussions, even amongst the sector, let alone then from the sector to others. And I remember, in Afghanistan, way back, say 2006. I mean, there was an effort to actually coordinate media development activity in the country because, as you said, it comes from so many different places, even just in the US government. So you have, in Afghanistan originally there was OTI support for media, and then it changed to democracy and governance, and then there's been money from DRL. In other countries, it might be CMM. If there's a humanitarian situation, it's another agency, and that's just state and USA. You haven't even got to. There's public diplomacy. And that's before you get to the military, and that's before you get to other governments and foundations. And I don't think ever in Afghanistan over the last 13 years has there been an effective way of having that conversation. I mean, more recently, I think it's probably been managed by the Public Diplomacy Office within the US Embassy, which is an interesting choice of a place to have that conversation. And I mean, to come back to the question about coordination. So, you have all of these donors. And interestingly, in Afghanistan, where you have so much conflict, guess who isn't there? CMM, conflict management and mitigation. So it's an odd collection of people, and there are so many. We have sort of, in Afghanistan at least, there was a fairly solid media development program. But then, there was the anti-corruption program, and there was this program and that program, and they were all designed beforehand. And so there just isn't much incentive actually when you're in the country to have those kinds of conversations. And other sectoral programs will have communications elements, but they'll be as much focused on PSAs as they will be on the media side of things. And so I've just reiterated what the problems are. I think. It's because we don't have continual assessments. We don't have we do an assessment at the beginning of a country engagement. So all of our organisations have gone to Burma in the last 2 years and done assessments about what we are going to do. But then there isn't necessarily a process in place for, I'm not sure about Burma, but in other places for managing that conversation after.
I think I'm not massively pessimistic about this. I think there's actually, the first thing I'd say in terms of how to get more attention to this, my own view is actually we should probably be talking less about the media. I think a lot of the discussion about media very quickly becomes a media conversation. I think if you want to get real focus on this within the context of fragile states, you talk about fragile states. You talk about what is making now fragile states fragile. And you get very much within the discourse on what people focused on fragile states and making them more stable and making them more successful. What are they most paying attention to? And that's what the briefing is largely trying to do, is to frame a set of arguments within the context of the fragile states discourse rather than the media discourse. And I think sometimes we get inside our own, because we're so passionate about the importance of media, we tend to sort of just assume that everyone agrees with it. Well, there's a lot of people who profoundly don't agree with it, and sometimes they've got quite good reason. And I think the reason I'm optimistic is that most donors and development actors are beginning to think much more politically. Over the last 5, 6, 7 years, there's a lot. Everyone is now doing political economy analysis. They're doing governance assessments. They're doing drivers of change analysis. They're doing all kinds of analysis, which are actually fundamentally trying to find out what is it in these countries and these societies that is actually shaping change. What is it that we need to be paying attention to? And every single example I've ever come across of anything that when that process is done well, they will pretty well centrally focus on how people are accessing information, how loyalty and information is being shaped, what the role of the media and communication is in these countries, as well as the more state-level analyses. So I think, my big argument is fundamentally that focus on fragility, focus on those issues. If media is not particularly important in that context, then that's fine. We don't need to focus on it. Generally, I think it is. And just ask for questions. And if these questions are built into the way in which the kind of diagnosis, the analysis is made about what is it that development actors can best do to support these countries, you do that analysis right, these issues will emerge. And that's why I'm quite optimistic about this. I think there is a shift now towards a more realistic analysis of what actually is happening in highly complex political environments, and this media and communication element is blindingly, obviously, central to that.
Well, thank you very much. I think we're out of time, but I will say that the endowment co-funded with UNESCO in Harare a few years ago the formative meeting of the Federation of African Journalists, and it sounds that from the excellent framing that's just taken place from this report, we're prepared to, or there's a need for a follow-on meeting to continue the discussion on this issue. And so anyone who would like to have input to that or has any ideas to that, feel free to contact SEMA here. And to that end, I'd really like to thank James Dean for coordinating and putting this policy briefing together. Amar and Michael, thank you for contributing to the discussion. Mark and SEMA, and especially Valerie Popper for helping put all of this together. And to all of you for taking the time out to come and share in this discussion. Thank you very much. Of course. Everybody knows there's lunch outside, yes. Thanks. That was a first for me, so there you go.